experience right there.
There you go.
So this is Merkoski. He's a designer, does user experience design. He's the head of the design department at Greenstart, which we'll talk more about. And before that, he was an executive creative director at Provocation, doing user experience products and services.
Thank you. Afternoon, morning, I don't know which one it is. Two quick questions for the audience. How many of you are designers of any kind at all? Easy peasy. In fact, screw the presentation, let's just chat. And then the second question I have is, how many of you actually do know roughly what Greenstart is, or that's even better, awesome, good. So, I want to talk a little bit about Greenstart before I kick into this. Today what I want to talk about is storytelling, but my Mac seems to have crashed, so I may do that without the assistance of slides. But before that, what I'm talking about is Greenstart. So Greenstart basically is a venture firm and a design studio, one and the same. So what that means is that we really are at our root a venture capital institution. We give capital, right, financing to young companies who are just starting. So we're like a seed stage, early stage venture capital. So we're not giving like hundreds of millions of dollars, right, to later stage companies who are well on their way. We're talking about really finding sort of rough gems in the world, unique ideas, unique people, and funding them and their companies in the early stages of their development. That's what venture capital firms do. And what we've done that's different, that's unique and innovative, we think, is we've actually built a design studio into that. And so in addition to giving people capital, cash, money, dollars, cents, to grow their companies, we actually design for them products, services, the brands, the experiences of their company, offering the value they try to put into the world. So what that looks like is myself and about a team of between 7 and 10 designers, some full-time, some part-time contract, working very closely in the studio space. The companies we work with join us in that studio space hand in hand. It's not like a client service model of design. It's very much a partnership and a collaboration. We sit with them and work iteratively. We sort of discover the problems fundamentally, like any design sort of project might, understand sort of the rationale, the problems, the fears, the hopes, all that. And then we move really into figuring out what tactical problems we can solve. It could be a new website, a new app, it could be a new logo, it could be so many ways in which design ramifies itself. But that's the work that we do. And we do that with them for about 3 to 6 months. And then over the course of however long that company's in business and grows, we continue to work with them in that fashion. We are essentially a design partner with that organization, with that startup. One last unique idea about the work that we do. Every venture capital firm has essentially a thesis or sort of a POV about what kind of firms they're looking at. It's sort of a bet on the future fundamentally, right? You think that these are going to be highly scalable, highly attractive companies in terms of the return that they provide, right? It's the business model of a venture firm. Our thesis that we have is called clean web. It's a new and emerging term. What it essentially gets to is that you can take products that are software in nature, right, that are services in nature, and you can apply the output of those products to the fundamental natural resource challenges that we're facing on Earth. So it's kind of a design for good argument. It says that things like Zipcar or OPower or Nest are fundamentally software-driven experiences that their byproduct means less global warming gases, means less traffic density, it means basically a better world for all of us. And so that's kind of the broad thesis that Greenstart occupies, is looking at those kinds of companies, investing cash and time primarily through design services in those companies, such that we're not just a venture firm trying to make money and grow and scale, but we are also trying to have an impact, a global impact, and thinking about entrepreneurship, the economy at a macro level, and fundamentally entrepreneurship itself as one of the major metrics that we can move the needle around climate change, around natural resource depletion, and other very large, broad, and nearly impossible goals. So that's what Greenstart is. Before I jump into the storytelling, any questions about that? Any curiosity about that I can answer? Cool. Well, the machine has told me.
Do you guys have metrics that you use to measure the impact that your business would have?
In terms of like natural resources and the impact it might have on climate, yeah. So it's a really thorny issue, right? The answer right now is no. But we are part of the Clean Web Initiative, whose primary purpose is to do that. And so the organizations that basically align with the Clean Web, you might say a membership, right, that are part of that, that organization's job is very much to look at not just our partner organizations, the ones we start, but also things like GoPower, Zipcar, and Airbnb, and Nest, and look at the quantification of the impact that they're having at scale, and kind of keep up to date and keep metrics like that alive. More as a storytelling kind of phenomenon than really saying like quantitatively here it is, but the goal is to get the Clean Web Initiative as an organization of bodies who all share in this vision to be the source of that kind of metric, that sort of measure. Yes. So, one of the reasons I'm talking about storytelling today is because when I was invited, I was told, I'm sure I got this correct, that essentially architecture for humanity is sort of broken into two distinct groups. Is that fair to anyone help me out? There's like resilience and yeah. And the other one was, sorry? Exactly, cool. And so it sounds like, in many ways, you know, it's something that a lot of brands go through, right? It's a sort of refactoring moment, right? You take what you have and you sort of repackage it, you rethink it, you reorganize it, and then you put that out into the world, and you see if that's a better model and a better way of thinking. Very common exercise, and what it usually means is that the sort of old model that you were in before, the brand, you might say, may not be as relevant in every case. And so it's a way of, it's time to think about telling the story differently. So whether that's the reason that you enjoy this presentation or this point of view, or because you're trying to tell your own very personal story, who you are and what value you provide in this world, right? If you buy into the idea that you are a brand as well, there's value in this presentation from that point of view. So fundamentally, it's a very high level, bigger than 30,000 feet. It's up in space level description about storytelling, and then we're going to rocket right back down at the very end with some tactics, and if we have time, some exercises as well to really kind of sink those tactics into the mind. All right. It's very important to tell a story from as close to your heart as possible. That is my child on the left when he was, I think, 2.5 years old, and that's some other child. It's a very important moment. I took a photo to remember it, and now apparently it's part of my story. He says basically he wants to tell me a story. Actually, he's telling the child at the same time, and so he tells the story. Here's my child's very first story. Once upon a time, the end. And that's it. That's the story, right? And they giggle and they laugh because they have no idea what the hell they're talking about. But what he had discovered, the most critical thing about a story is that it has a frame, right? And once upon a time, the end is the frame of, you might say any story, right? Another way of saying this is it has a beginning and a middle and an end, right? That's the same way of saying this, but the idea that stories have frames. And the important thing about frames is how do we come to learn them? Right? When I said once upon a time, the end, you've all heard that so many times because that frame, right, that specific semantics, that expression of a frame, has been passed down, you might say, culturally, right? We hear that frame quite a lot. And we hear people like our fathers and our grandfathers tell these stories, and our mothers and our sisters tell these stories, and we kind of repeat and adopt them. And we sort of grow up to want to use them unwittingly, unknowingly, right? We sort of like tell the same stories that our parents or our grandparents told. They're built into us, is what I'm saying about the stories. And it's not just that, right? We live in a beautifully crazy world where stories are being told by so many people. In fact, at a level and a depth that's far greater than probably most of our parents were able to tell us stories. And so we inherit these kind of cultural memes, right? These sort of frames of being able to tell stories, and you know, stories within stories, and the kind of like recursion that happens when storytelling frames start eating storytelling frames. And that's really what I want to talk about, right? Is the process of understanding how you tell your story in a world where this is happening, where your story is truly going to be embedded in someone else's story inside of a cultural frame of storytelling itself. All right, so I just did the thing that you're going to do, right? Which is, first thing you do is you tell them you're going to tell a story, and then you tell a story, and then you tell them you told the story. That's storytelling in a nutshell. And any story that you watch, whether it's a film or a book or a TED presentation, it really does have this structure. And when I say it really does, they may not be good at using this structure. They may not have sort of adequately hit every one of these marks, but there's no question that they're doing it. Just the act of getting up on stage and clearing your throat could be a way of telling people you're about to tell a story, right? It's a sort of a guttural act that says, I'm about to talk, right? Then there's the speech act, the actual telling of the story itself, right? The impression that there is truth or wisdom or ideas or knowledge, and then there is the actual closing, right? Which we'll get into at the end in terms of how that works. Why does this matter? Because I believe stories are the deep structure of being. And I use that capital B in the Heideggerian sense of being, right? And I have a really cute quote that actually I think I'll dive out because you guys are all designers and you can excuse the behind the scenes moment. So here's the Heidegger quote about being. How many of you have read Being in Time, by the way, by Heidegger? Anyone? A couple of hands. All right, so he says, what is the being that will give access to the question of the meaning of being? Heidegger's answer is that it can only be that being for whom the question of being is important, the being for whom being matters. Yes. Got that? All he's saying is that stories keep us alive, right? They beat back the wilderness and the dark and the night. Yeah, we know this trope very familiar, right? We understand why this matters. Stories really do provide meaning. Period. Takeaway about storytelling, why do we do it? Because in a world where we are increasingly searching for meaning, with so many signals being sent our way, whether it's in our families, in our grandparents, or it's the media, stories are what give us meaning. They are what provide hope against death. Now, there are fundamentally two ways in which that meaning is transcribed. And I literally mean that transcribed out in the world between your voice, or whatever medium of storytelling it is, and your thoughts, the person, the receiver's, the audience's thoughts, right? That meaning that you are trying to impart. There are two broad classifications of how you do that. And the first is analogy, right? Analogy is this is like that. You tell stories in a way that is relatable. You say a car is like a horse. Yeah? A car is not a horse, right? And so the hard part with analogies is always trying to figure out which pieces don't belong, right? There's no feedback, right? There's no horseshoes, and there's these things called carburetors. So it's not quite fitting, right? And it's always a mismatch in an analogy, right? This is like the sun, right? But it's not the sun, yeah? And then there's metaphor. And metaphor is this is that, right? You're claiming, you're occupying mental space there and saying, don't think of it like something. Think of it as something. This is something. Now this is a phenomenal tool in the toolkit of human communication, broadly speaking, in any medium. Recently they were doing some fMRI research, right? So functional MRI research, and they were looking at basically what's going on in the brain when they hear metaphors versus analogies. And the study they did is kind of brilliant, right? They said, all right, let's take some metaphors that are really kind of tangible, or touch-oriented, or texture-oriented, right? Like wet behind the ears. Yeah? That's a great metaphor, right? Someone's wet behind the ears, right? Versus they're kind of inexperienced, right? Which would be the non-metaphorical way of saying that, right? Or you might say, green behind the gills even, right? Like there's so many metaphors that are so physical and texture in nature. And what they saw when the participants in the MRI were basically exposed to analogies versus metaphors, it was literally, the metaphors were literally lighting up the touch centers in the brain, right? You literally are getting in there with your fingers and you're massaging the brain in different senses than normal language you might assume. It's not just a textual and a verbal sense of the brain. You're actually triggering a very deep-rooted emotive sense of feeling with metaphors. This fire and the way it makes you feel is far more profound, is what I'm arguing, in terms of the number of synapses and the mental sort of construct of a metaphor than something like this in an analogy. So the meaning that can lead from that is really critical when you think about using analogy versus metaphor, but fundamentally underneath that you still have one problem, which is what is the message? What are you trying to communicate? What are you saying, basically? Right? Because we all cloak and we all wrap the message in so many beautiful ways, metaphor and analogy. But how do you get to the essence of what it is that you're trying to say in the first place? This is critical for storytellers, right? Because we do live in a world full of marketing, full of communications, full of branding, full of messages and signals that are just absolutely intended to convey a message, whether through analogy or metaphor, and make us believe something, have meaning. So if you can get to the essence of what you're trying to say first, before you start employing the expression of that message, you will be far more successful in transmitting meaning. So, we have this thing called the hook that we like to do with our startup companies. There's lots of ways people have talked about this. The hook is not some technical term. You can reinvent the term if you want, but the practice is the same. Essentially, when you try to understand the message that you want to transmit, when you want to understand the essence of what you want to say, particularly in a group phenomenon, particularly when you have different points of view with different shared definitions and meanings of the words that you would use, one of the most amazing techniques is to just get to the root of it and talk about only nouns and verbs, or objects and actions, right? Why is that so difficult? It's so difficult because it's so boring. We live in a world of marketing and messaging and branding and communication where everything's been dressed up with adjectives and adverbs and neologisms and memes, and it sounds so exciting. But the actual process of reducing things to nouns and verbs is dry and boring, and no one does it. But that's my argument, is do that. Think about doing that first. I'm going to explain why. To do that, I'm going to show a little video.
Hello, guys, what's happened to this dream factory? When I first started coming up with friendly phrases that put a positive spin on what some organisation is self-evidently doing, people said that that was totally unnecessary and no way for an honourable man to earn a living. Then I landed the 10-7 water contract and came up with bringing water to people who need it. Stick that in fake handwriting on all the vans, I said, and that will in some way be good. Guys, I'm afraid we're getting tired. Tim, have you come up with anything for that fleet of delivery vans?
Alright, it's when there's a thing in a place, but the people whose thing it is need it in another place, then wouldn't it be good if there was some kind of system where...
Too long! Much too long! Right, all I'm rather to do, that's paint vans.
Making paint for obvious reasons.
No, you can't say it's obvious, that's death! It's all obvious! Julie, Department of Health?
Working with you to stop you dying, brackets sometimes.
Department of Education?
Hopefully ensuring you can read this.
Oh, in fact,
I come up with one that will work for all government departments. Being the governmental department named above.
that's a disaster! You can't give them a multi-purpose one.
It would be a big saving in terms of
What money they give to us? What we're selling to them is the idea that people can no longer cope with things being simply labelled, but need some kind of hand-holding accompanying phrase.
So that's what it would be like if we lived in a world where truly the essence of the value or the meaning of something was portrayed to us as it were, right? We would quickly tire of that. So, go through an example, Nissan Leaf, right? How many of you see this commercial at all? Alright, think about metaphor on the back of your mind with this one. Alright, so the hook. Drivers don't need gasoline. That's it. That's the essence of the meaning of the message they're trying to communicate to you, right? And it is wrapped up in a metaphor, and it's done so in a storytelling fashion that gives the transmissible possibility for this meaning to occur to you, right? Drivers don't need gasoline. Here's another example. Researchers tried to synthesize something that looks like this, basically the sort of noun version of it, the hook version of this. The expression that takes a phrase like this in a public reporting sense. Nanotechnology turns plants into common plastic, right? Because the actual description here, nanoparticles, wire catalyst, and nothing properly, does not have any essence to it. The hook, plants turning into plastic, right? That's all that's going on. So you can take anything as abstruse as a research concept that has fundamental at its level jargon and science that you would have to have research degrees to understand, right? And this is in large part what the press does for us, is makes these things transmissible and makes them understandable. They search for the essence of things. You might say that's the objective form of journalism. Other examples, just make sure you fully get what I'm saying. Noun, verb, noun, whatever it means, right? Don't dress this thing up. Make sure you understand the essence of what you're saying. We just recently went through a rebrand, and that was one of the most fundamentally difficult things for us to do. Everyone has a challenge with this, which is it's an internal exercise to sit and consider the essence, nouns and verbs, to define what kind of message, story, or meaning you want to share. So for us, it was venture, firm, and design studio, and frankly, we didn't get around to ever figuring out the verb, and that was our problem. Because it's so hard as an internal exercise, particularly in a group setting, that to even align on that is in fact the point of the exercise. You may use it from then on in no fashion or shape, but as the alignment for the team to understand the essence of what they're trying to communicate, or not be able to align, it is incredibly valuable. So, I argue all of you have a story to tell somewhere in some fashion, whether professionally or personally, and would all benefit from doing the exercise of sitting down with yourselves or your groups and thinking about the nouns and verbs that define the story that you're trying to tell. What I want to now give you is some tips and tricks about once you have the essence, once you have the nouns and verbs, what are some of the ways that you might actually express it. So metaphor and analogy are the two buckets that we go into, right? There are some others, but primarily those are two pretty often repeated and common ways of seeing the expression of it. But what are some tips and tricks inside of expressing the essence of that
that are very profound, again, operate sort of on the psychological level of the audience. So the first that I'll argue is provocation. What if? Every time you ask a what if, the audience is going to answer with a what is. Right? They're always going to imagine kind of where the current state is in relation to the what if that you're proposing could be. That provocation is a way of moving mind. It's a way of taking the message, the nouns, the verbs, the essence of what it is you're trying to exchange, and using their natural reaction to want to answer what is to what if as a means of moving that and transmitting that meaning into their minds. By provoking people, by suggesting an alternative, you've given them both a license to renew their thinking about what is, as well as begin to consider the possibility of the what if. I highly recommend Nancy Duarte's talk on TED if you haven't seen that one, where she breaks down everything from MLK's I Have a Dream speech to Steve Jobs' presentations, and talks about them in the light of provocations, and the rhythm and the cadence in which you get into the provocation. You might argue that massaging the brain through metaphor that I was talking about earlier, directly touching the textile and sensate mind, that's what provocation is doing. It's using metaphor specifically as a means of transmitting ideas at a much more phenomenological level of how you receive ideas than just sort of a syntax or language level. The second one is repetition. Repeating things strengthens their essence. Repeating things strengthens their essence. If you repeat things, again, psychological trick of the mind and the audience and the reception of messages, people will begin to hear it. By repeating things, you strengthen their message, the essence of the message in particular. And the last one, the one that is hardest for everybody to do, because we like to believe that somehow storytelling does not involve what is about 80% of human communication, which is phatic communication, right? So my prancing, my prattling, my walking, my gesturing, and all that is phatic communication, right? It's not coming from the content of the idea as much as it is coming from the gesture and the in situ form in which the story is told. There's phatic communication in all sorts of mediums, not just in the personal, but the notion that basically your ability to transmit a story and the meaning therein is not entirely dependent on just the words. It's not just the script. It's not just the image. It's not just the presentation. It's not just the website. There's an entire sort of, let's say, menagerie or whatever of like ways in which you can tell stories. And improvisation is the method with which you discover them. Improvisation is when you allow play into the process of storytelling and you basically challenge each other or yourself as a means of telling your story differently, as exposing opportunities and possibilities that you didn't consider. So it's a call to arms again to say, improvise. After you've built the script, or you've built the deck, or you've built the website, improvise with people around what that could be, particularly in this kind of format, where you're talking out loud in communication, person-to-person storytelling. You'll find it's a pretty remarkable technique. All right, so I told you I was going to tell you a story. In this case, it was about storytelling. I told you the story about storytelling. And now this is the hardest part, right? The hardest part is closure. It really isn't telling them you told a story. That I told you a story about storytelling, right? I invoked analogy and metaphor as two primary means in which to express that. And then the message underneath, the search for that, is to go through an exercise like the hook and identify the nouns and the verbs, right? That if you do that, and combine with some tricks like repetition, provocation, and improvisation, you'll have a higher than not chance of being able to transmit some meaning of the message that you actually want to transmit. Now, that's me telling you the story, but the best way to actually end the story, this is the last trick, trick number 4, all things come in threes I guess, but not always, is to basically open up something new. Yeah? It's what you actually see in TED Talks when, particularly the TED Prize winners, now at this point, almost anybody in TEDx, ends their talk with what would they like you to do. Right? How can you contribute? How can you help their cause? That's an open invitation to begin a new dialogue, begin a new conversation. So while your time on the stage ends, or while the website gets clicked away from, there are always opportunities to start something new, and you might say in this sense, nothing is ever closed, no story is ever ended, you're always inside of someone else's frame. So, thank you for that, and depending on my time,